On a frozen forest road in northern Washington, a Navy SEAL on leave eased his truck to a stop as snow swept sideways through the trees. Because ahead of him, in the white silence, he saw something that didn't belong there. A young woman on crutches. One leg gone. A German shepherd walking close at her side, guarding her every step. Snow soaked her coat. The wind cut through her like glass. Each step forward looked heavier than the last. She didn't wave for help, didn't look back. She just kept moving, as if surviving the night wasn't a choice anymore, but something she had been forced to learn alone. The SEAL stepped out into the storm, snow biting at his face, and spoke calmly, without urgency, without fear. "Ride with me. No one should face a night like this alone. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, hit subscribe so you never miss another tale of loyalty, courage, and heart. Your support truly means the world." Snow drifted through the pines of northern Washington, muffling the forest and turning the road ahead into a pale, endless corridor of silence. Mason Cole had learned long ago how to move through silence. At 35, the U.S. Navy SEAL sat behind the wheel of his pickup with the posture of a man who never fully relaxed, even when nothing seemed to be happening. Broad-shouldered and powerfully built, he carried his strength without display. His dark hair was cut short in regulation style, flecked now with the first hints of gray at the temples. A trimmed beard shadowed a face shaped by sharp angles and restraint, the kind that rarely betrayed emotion. His eyes, steady and observant, had seen too much to look away easily. Only a week earlier, those same eyes had stared across deserts in Iraq and Syria. Operation Silent Lantern had lasted a full year. Night extractions, long surveillance, civilian rescues that never made the news, losses that never reached headlines. Mason had done his job with precision, but precision came at a cost. When he returned to base, his commander called him in, not with ceremony, not with congratulations. The commander studied him for a long moment and spoke plainly. Mason had been holding himself together on discipline alone. That worked in combat, but it hollowed men out if left unchecked. The order came quietly but firmly. 6 months of leave, personally approved. Not for travel, not for celebration. But to learn how to breathe like an ordinary man again before the next mission. The unit didn't need a SEAL who could perform flawlessly while breaking inside. Mason accepted the decision without argument. He always did. Now, he drove north through the Okanogan-Wenatchee Forest, returning to a cabin and a small farm he hadn't truly lived in for years. The land waited the way it always had, patient, indifferent, unchanged. So much else had changed. 6 years earlier, Mason had married Brielle Hart, his high school sweetheart. She had been bright and striking then, with honey blonde hair and a smile that drew people in easily. She worked in interior design, a profession built on warmth and aesthetics, and she loved plans, gatherings, and visible signs of stability. In the beginning, she told him she understood his career. She told him love would be enough. It wasn't. On the first anniversary of their marriage, Mason was deployed and unreachable, deep inside a classified operation in the Middle East. The call came when he was finally allowed one brief connection. Brielle's voice had been calm, practiced. She said she was tired of being alone, tired of holidays spent fixing broken doors herself, tired of sleeping beside absence. She said she had met someone else, Trent Caldwell, a wealthy construction contractor who was always present, always available, always safe. Mason had listened in silence. He did not beg. He did not argue. The mission came first, even as his marriage ended through static and distance. He protected families he would never meet. He just couldn't save his own. The road narrowed as the storm thickened. Snow fell heavier now, blown sideways by sharp gusts of wind. Mason eased his speed, senses alert. That was when he saw her, a figure ahead barely visible through the white, a young woman moving slowly along the shoulder of the road. She leaned heavily on a pair of crutches, her balance careful and deliberate. One leg was gone, replaced by a prosthetic hidden beneath soaked fabric. Beside her walked a German shepherd, large and alert, its thick black and tan coat already dusted with snow. Mason slowed the truck to a controlled stop. The woman was in her late 20s, slim but tense with exhaustion. Dark auburn hair clung wetly to her cheeks beneath a knit cap pulled low. Her skin was pale from cold, lips tinged blue, but her eyes were sharp, wary, intelligent, and untrusting. She kept one hand tightly wrapped around the dog's leash, as if it anchored her to the ground. The dog, about 4 years old, stood protectively at her side. Strong, broad-chested, with intelligent amber eyes, it positioned itself subtly between Mason and the woman, muscles coiled but calm. This was not an aggressive animal. It was a trained guardian, loyal and deliberate. Mason lowered his window. "I'm not stopping traffic," he said evenly. His voice was deep, steady, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without raising it. "There's no town for miles." She glanced at his jacket, at the faint outline of military bearing in the way he held himself. Her grip tightened. Experience had taught her caution. The wind howled between them. Mason met her gaze without pressing forward and said quietly, firmly, "Ride with me. No one should face a night like this alone." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't rehearsed. They were simply true. She hesitated, breath visible in short, shallow bursts. Pride warred with survival. She had learned not to trust easily. But the storm didn't care about pride, and one leg made endurance a losing battle. Slowly, she nodded. The dog relaxed just enough to signal acceptance. Mason stepped out, helped her into the passenger seat with careful respect, then opened the back door for the German shepherd, who climbed in without resistance, settling protectively behind her. As Mason pulled back onto the road, the heater began to work against the cold. Neither of them spoke. Snow swallowed their tire tracks behind them, but for the first time that night, neither of them was moving forward alone. The heater hummed softly as Mason's truck moved deeper into the forest road, snow whispering beneath the tires. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was cautious, like two wounded animals sharing the same shelter without yet trusting it. Ellie Wren sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, fingers pale from cold and tension. Up close, Mason could see she was 27 at most, her face still young but etched with a kind of exhaustion that didn't belong to her age. She was slim, almost fragile in build, with narrow shoulders and a posture trained to compensate for loss. Her auburn hair, darkened by melted snow, fell in loose strands from beneath a knitted hat. Her skin was fair, marked by the faint shadows of sleepless nights. Her eyes were gray-green, sharp and observant, the eyes of someone who had learned to read danger quickly. Atlas, the German shepherd, lay across the back seat, 4 years old and powerfully built. His coat was thick and well cared for, his ears alert even as his body relaxed slightly in the warmth. He watched Mason through the rearview mirror, not aggressively but attentively, as if measuring the man's intentions. This dog wasn't a stray. He was a companion, a protector. After a mile of silence, Ellie finally spoke. "It's my birthday," she said quietly, not looking at Mason. Her voice was steady, but it carried a flatness that suggested the words meant very little to her now. Mason glanced at her briefly, then back to the road. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't offer hollow comfort. He simply nodded, acknowledging the weight of the statement. Ellie took a slow breath. "I didn't plan to be out there. I wasn't wandering." She paused, choosing her words carefully, as if saying the wrong thing might make this fragile safety disappear. "I was staying with my aunt," she continued. "Her name is Ruth Wren." The name carried no warmth when she spoke it. Ruth was a woman in her early 60s, tall and rigid, with iron-gray hair always pulled into a tight bun and a face shaped by years of stern conviction. She belonged to a small, insular, religious community on the edge of town, one that clung to old doctrines and stricter interpretations of suffering. Ruth believed hardship was a test sent by God. She believed weakness, especially visible weakness, was something to be corrected or cast out. Ellie had lived under Ruth's roof since the accident. "They don't say it outright," Ellie said, her gaze fixed on the snow-blurred windshield. "But everyone knows what they think, that being broken means you're unfinished, that you remind them of things they don't want to face." She shifted slightly, adjusting the prosthetic hidden beneath her coat. The movement was practiced, automatic. Mason noticed how carefully she controlled her balance, how every motion was deliberate. The argument had started over something small, it always did. Ellie had mentioned applying for remote design work, freelance illustration, logo layouts, work she could do sitting down, quietly, without asking anyone for help. Ruth had listened in silence, then told her that ambition was pride, that accepting her condition with humility meant knowing her place. "She told me I was refusing God's lesson," Ellie said, "that I was trying to pretend I wasn't what I am." Atlas stirred at her feet, sensing the shift in her breathing. Ellie reached back, resting her fingers briefly against his fur, grounding herself. "I told her I didn't need to be punished to be faithful," Ellie continued, "and she told me to leave, just like that." The house hadn't been warm even before that, but when Ruth opened the door and stood aside, her expression unmoved. Something inside Ellie had gone cold in a way no storm could match. "She said I'd come back when I understood gratitude." Ellie swallowed. "I didn't have anywhere else." The plan had been simple, desperate, and foolish. Walk to the old church on the edge of town. The building had been abandoned for years, but the stone walls still stood. She thought she could wait out the night there, maybe call a shelter in the morning. She hadn't expected the storm to come down so fast. "No money," she said. "No car. My phone died an hour before you saw me." Mason tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw setting in a way that suggested anger held carefully in check. He said nothing, but Ellie sensed it. The restrained fury of a man who knew too well how systems failed the vulnerable. "It sounds worse when I say it out loud," she added softly. "It sounds exactly like what it is," Mason replied. "Someone pushing responsibility onto Faith." Ellie looked at him then, surprised. Really looked at him. His profile was calm, controlled, but there was something hard beneath it, something shaped by long exposure to injustice wearing different uniforms. Atlas shifted again, this time settling more fully, his head resting against the seat, his breathing slowed. Trust earned by degrees. "I didn't want help," Ellie said after a moment. "Out there. I didn't want to need it." Mason nodded. "Needing help doesn't make you weak." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "That depends who you ask." The road curved, trees closing in tighter around them. In the distance, faint lights marked the edge of Mason's property. The storm still raged, but the wind had softened, as if exhausted by its own violence. Ellie's shoulders slumped slightly as she saw the lights. Relief flickered across her face before she could hide it. "I won't stay long," she said quickly, "just until the storm passes." Mason didn't answer right away. He slowed the truck as they turned onto the long, narrow drive leading toward the cabin. "We'll get you warm first," he said. "Then we'll talk." Ellie nodded, gripping. Atlas's leash more loosely now. Behind them, the forest swallowed their footprints, the night closing in on the road where she had walked alone. Ahead, the cabin waited, dimly lit, imperfect but standing. And for the first time since dawn, Ellie Wren was no longer moving forward because she had nowhere else to go. The cabin was cold when Mason pushed the door open, the kind of cold that had settled deep into the wood after years of being left alone. Snow clung to his boots as he stepped inside, flipping on a single lamp that cast a warm but tired glow across the room. The space was simple and functional, a wooden table scarred by time, a worn couch pushed against the wall, a stone fireplace that hadn't been lit in days. Ellie hesitated in the doorway. Up close, the cabin felt intimate in a way that unsettled her. She was used to borrowed rooms, spare beds, corners of houses where she never fully belonged. Standing there, balancing on one leg, she looked suddenly very small. Mason noticed immediately and moved without comment, taking her coat gently, hanging it near the fire. "Sit," he said, not as a command, but as an offering. He knelt by the fireplace, stacking logs with practiced efficiency. When the fire caught, the sound was soft at first, then steady. Flames climbed, filling the room with warmth and the faint smell of pine. Mason handed Ellie a thick wool blanket, then a towel, then a mug of hot water he'd heated on the stove. Atlas stepped inside last, shaking snow from his coat in a wide arc. He was a large German shepherd, 4 years old, with a powerful chest and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Once dry, he circled Ellie twice before lying down close enough that his side pressed against her leg. He let out a long breath, content, finally off duty. Ellie wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers. The shaking in her shoulders slowed, but didn't stop completely. "Thank you," she said quietly. Mason nodded and sat across from her, close enough to share the fire, far enough not to crowd her. He waited. After a while, Ellie spoke again. "I haven't told many people this," she said, staring into the flames. "Not because it's a secret, just because it feels heavy to hand it to someone." She took a breath that trembled despite her control. "It was a gas explosion," she continued, "in the apartment building where we lived. Her parents had been ordinary people with ordinary jobs. Her father worked maintenance for the city. Her mother was a night nurse at a children's clinic. Her younger sister, Lily, had been 14, loud, kind. The kind of girl who brought home injured birds and cried over roadkill. They were all asleep when the pipes ruptured. Ellie remembered waking under rubble, air thick with dust and smoke, the weight crushing her lower body. She remembered screaming until her voice was gone. Rescue came hours later. The doctors were kind, but honest. Her left leg couldn't be saved. "My family didn't make it out," she said softly. "I did." The words hung between them. Survivor's guilt was not dramatic. It was quiet. It showed up in small moments, like birthdays, like mirrors, like the question of why one life continued while others didn't. Mason listened, without interruption. He didn't flinch. He didn't rush her grief. When she finished, he simply said, "I'm sorry you had to carry that alone." Ellie's eyes burned. Mason stared into the fire, the crackle reflecting in his eyes. "I was married once," he said. "High school sweetheart. We thought loving each other would solve everything." He didn't soften the truth. He talked about missed anniversaries, about silence across oceans, about how protecting strangers sometimes cost him the one person who was supposed to stay. "I kept thinking I could fix it later," he said. "Turns out, some things don't wait." Outside, the storm howled, but inside the fire held. Time passed without being measured. Then Mason stood. He opened the pantry. There wasn't much. A box of pancake mix, a small bag of sugar, a stick of butter wrapped in paper. From the back of a drawer, he pulled out a single candle, bent slightly at the tip. Ellie watched him, confused. "You said it was your birthday," he said. "That still counts, even if the day went wrong." He worked quietly, awkward but determined. The cake came out uneven, edges darker than intended. He didn't apologize for it. He placed it on the table, set the candle in the center, and lit it carefully. The flame flickered. Mason cleared his throat, suddenly uncertain. He wasn't a man who sang, not in public, not ever, but he did. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ellie. Happy birthday to you." His voice was low, rough, imperfect. It cracked slightly on her name. Ellie pressed a hand to her mouth as tears spilled freely. Atlas lifted his head, tail thumping once, then again, sensing the shift in energy. He moved closer, placing his chin on Ellie's knee as if adding his own silent blessing. "Make a wish," Mason said gently. "Close your eyes." Ellie obeyed. She didn't wish for miracles. She wished for warmth, for belonging, for nights that didn't end with her walking alone into the dark. She blew out the candle. Smoke curled upward, thin and fragile, then disappeared. They didn't speak right away. The fire popped softly. Atlas sighed and stretched. Two strangers, bound by loss, sat together in the quiet, the space between them no longer empty. For the first time in years, Ellie didn't feel like survival was something she had to earn. Morning arrived quietly after the storm, pale light filtering through frost-laced windows. The world outside the cabin looked rinsed clean, as if the night had carried something heavy away with it. Ellie stayed just a few days. That was how she said it at first. A practical pause until the roads cleared, until she could figure out what came next. But days slipped into one another without ceremony, and no one marked the moment when temporary became something gentler, something allowed. Mason returned to the rhythms of the land. He split wood behind the cabin, shoulders working in steady arcs, breath fogging in the cold air. The work suited him. It was honest, repetitive, and quiet enough for his thoughts to loosen their grip. He cleared snow from the paths, checked the fence lines, tended to small repairs the storm had left behind. He didn't talk much while he worked, but there was no tension in the silence. It was the kind that made room instead of closing it off. Ellie found her place indoors at first. She moved carefully through the cabin, relearning its shape with each pass. She cooked simple meals from what Mason had stocked, soups that warmed from the inside out, bread that filled the air with a comforting weight. She cleaned, not because she was asked to, but because making a space livable made her feel less like a guest waiting to be told when to leave. One afternoon, she unpacked a small roll of sketches from her bag and pinned a few of her drawings to the wall near the window. Forest lines, a dog's profile, a woman standing in snow, unfinished but upright. The cabin felt less hollow afterward. Atlas took on the role of bridge without effort. At 4 years old, he was large and well-muscled, his movements precise but relaxed. In the mornings, he nudged Mason's elbow insistently, leash clutched in his mouth, demanding a walk. Mason complied, sometimes grumbling, sometimes smiling despite himself. In the evenings, Atlas gravitated to Ellie, lowering his heavy head onto her lap, eyes half closed as if guarding her rest. He seemed to understand that both humans needed anchoring, just in different ways. They ate dinner together most nights. No candles, no ceremony. Just plates set across from each other, the fire murmuring nearby. Conversation came in pieces. A comment about the weather. A memory about a childhood dog. A question left unanswered because it didn't need one. Coffee in the mornings followed the same pattern, steam rising, hands warming around mugs, the wind threading through the pines outside like a slow breath. Ellie noticed changes in herself first. The tightness in her chest eased. She slept through the night without waking in panic. She laughed once, softly, surprised by the sound, and then covered her mouth as if afraid it might be taken back. Mason noticed too, though he never said it. He noticed how she moved more confidently through the space, how she no longer flinched at sudden sounds, how she met his, eyes without bracing for something to be asked of her. Mason changed in quieter ways. He began leaving his jacket on the hook by the door instead of wearing it inside, as if reminding himself he was not on patrol. He lingered longer at the table after meals. Once, while repairing a chair leg, he caught himself humming without realizing it. The sound startled him more than any noise the storm had made. On the third morning after the roads reopened, a truck crunched up the drive. The driver was a local mail carrier named Tom Avery, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and a gray beard that looked permanently dusted with snow. He wore his job like a habit rather than a duty, moving slowly but deliberately. Tom tipped his cap at Mason, offered a polite nod toward Ellie, and handed over a small stack of mail without questions or commentary. He didn't linger, he didn't pry. In a place like this, discretion was a form of respect. Ellie watched from the window as Tom drove away. She hadn't realized how tense she'd been until the sound of the truck faded. "You don't get many visitors," she said. Mason shrugged. "Just enough." That afternoon, Ellie stepped outside more often, leaning on her crutches, letting the cold air brush her cheeks. She stood on the porch while Mason worked nearby, the distance between them comfortable. At one point she sketched him quickly, broad frame against white ground, head bowed in concentration. She didn't show him the drawing. Some things were allowed to exist quietly. The days held no declarations, no promises. They didn't name what was forming between them, and that restraint felt like respect rather than avoidance. Both of them had learned what happened when expectations moved faster than healing. As evening fell, the cabin filled with familiar sounds, the crackle of fire, the soft clink of dishes, Atlas's steady breathing. Ellie looked around the room, at the drawings on the wall, the chair Mason had fixed, the window that no longer felt like an exit. For the first time since the accident, since the loss, since the long stretch of borrowed spaces, Ellie realized she wasn't counting days anymore. And Mason, watching the fire burn low, understood something just as quietly. He didn't feel repaired. He didn't feel finished. But the ache inside him had softened into something manageable, something human. The wounds were still there. They just weren't bleeding. The afternoon settled into a quiet stillness, the kind that followed hard weather. Outside, Mason worked along the edge of the property, checking beams and hinges the storm had tested. His movements were methodical, focused, as if keeping his hands busy kept his thoughts from wandering too far. Inside the cabin, Ellie moved through the small storage room at the back of the house. It was a narrow space, lined with shelves that held old tools, coiled rope, jars of nails, and the remnants of a life paused rather than abandoned. Dust hung in the air, lit by a single window. She hadn't gone looking for anything personal. That was what unsettled her most. Behind a stack of folded tarps, she noticed a small wooden box. It was unmarked except for faint scratches along the lid, the kind left by time and careless hands. The wood was smooth where it had been handled often, worn down at the edges. Ellie picked it up and felt its weight. Inside were letters, dozens of them, handwritten. The paper yellowed and softened, corners frayed, ink faded but still legible. Each envelope bore the same careful handwriting. Ellie froze. She knew immediately what they were. Not because she had read a single word yet, but because of how carefully they had been kept. These were not things meant to be revisited casually. They were preserved, protected. She sat down slowly on an overturned crate, the box resting in her lap. Her first instinct was to close it and put it back exactly where she had found it. The past was not hers to touch. She had lived too long in borrowed spaces to forget that rule. But another part of her, quiet, aching, and human, wanted to understand the man who had opened his home to her without question. The man who split wood in silence. The man who sang to her on a night she had expected to survive, not remember. Ellie's hands trembled as she lifted a single letter from the stack. Just one. The envelope was addressed in careful ink, written by someone younger, less guarded. She unfolded the paper slowly, as if the years inside it might shatter if rushed. She took a breath. Then she began to read. To the girl I love, I've been staring at this paper for a long time, trying to figure out how to start without sounding dumb. I'm not really good with words. I always worry I'll say the wrong thing, or not enough, or too much. But I didn't want another day to pass without telling you this. Sometimes when I see you in the hallway at school, everything else just kind of goes quiet, like the lockers, the noise, the people. None of it matters for a second. It's just you walking past, and me trying not to forget how to breathe. I don't know how to explain it better than that. I know I'm not smooth. I know I'm awkward. I trip over my own thoughts all the time. But if you ever feel tired, or lonely, or like the world is heavier than it should be, I want to be the person who shows up. Even if I don't have the perfect thing to say. Even if all I can do is stand there and mean it. I don't know where life is going to take me. I don't know what I'll end up doing, or where I'll end up living. But when I think about who I want beside me while I figure it out, it's always you. I'm already nervous about the prom, mostly because I'm afraid I'll step on your feet when we dance. I promise I'll try not to, and if I do, I'll make it up to you with snacks and bad jokes afterward. I guess what I'm trying to say is this is real for me. I don't know everything about love yet. Maybe love is something you learn as you go. If that's true, I want to learn it with you, slowly, honestly, one day at a time. Mason. Ellie lowered the letter to her lap, breath unsteady. She felt no jealousy, no resentment. What she felt was a slow, aching sadness, not for herself, but for the purity of what had once existed. The kind of love untouched by disappointment or distance. The kind that believed showing up would always be enough. She understood, in that moment, that Mason hadn't merely lost a marriage. He had lost a future he had once believed in completely. Ellie folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, arranging the others exactly as she had found them. She closed the lid and rested her hand on the wood for a long moment, as if acknowledging the life it represented. When she stood, something inside her had shifted. Later that evening, Mason came in from the cold, boots dusted with snow. Ellie sat at the table, sketching quietly. Atlas lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but attentive. "You get everything sorted?" Mason asked casually, hanging his coat. "Yes," Ellie replied. Her voice was steady, too steady. Dinner passed without incident. Conversation stayed light. The fire burned low, but Ellie's thoughts were elsewhere, circling the truth she had uncovered. That night, she lay awake long after the cabin had gone quiet, and the letter replayed in her mind. Not the words themselves, but what they meant. Mason had loved deeply, honestly, without reservation. That kind of love didn't disappear. It waited. Ellie stared at the ceiling. Atlas curled at the foot of the bed, his steady breathing anchoring her to the present. By morning, the thought had hardened into resolve. If the past came back to claim him, she would not be the reason it was denied. The knock came just before dusk, sharp and insistent, cutting through the quiet Mason had grown used to. Atlas lifted his head first, ears alert, a low warning rumbling in his chest. Mason opened the door and froze. Brielle stood on the porch, snow dusting the shoulders of her long wool coat. She looked thinner than he remembered. Her honey-blonde hair no longer carefully styled but pulled back hastily, strands loose around a face marked by exhaustion. Her skin was pale, eyes red-rimmed and swollen, mascara faintly smudged beneath them. She had always been beautiful in a way that drew attention easily, but tonight that beauty felt brittle, strained by fear and regret. "Mason," she whispered, as if saying his name might anchor her. Then she broke. Her shoulders shook as she cried, words tumbling out unevenly. She had heard he was home. A former SEAL Team 5 operator, someone they both knew years ago, had mentioned it without thinking. She hadn't planned to come like this. She hadn't planned anything at all. Inside, Ellie stood still, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. She understood immediately who the woman was. Some truths didn't need introductions. Brielle's story poured out in fragments. The man she left Mason for, Trent Caldwell, had seemed safe at first. Wealthy, present, attentive. But the charm had hardened into control, the affection into suspicion. Drinking that began as social turned habitual. Arguments escalated, doors slammed, apologies followed bruises she learned to hide. There were other women too, discovered through whispers and text messages never meant to be seen. "I was wrong," Brielle sobbed. "I thought love was supposed to be easy. I thought I deserved more than waiting alone." She looked past Mason then, her gaze landing on Ellie. The moment tightened. "You," Brielle said, her voice sharpening despite the tears. "You don't belong here. This is my family, my marriage." Ellie felt the words land like stones. That night, she packed quietly. She didn't slam doors. She didn't confront anyone. She folded her clothes with care, hands steady despite the ache spreading through her chest. Atlas watched her closely, confusion clouding his intelligent eyes. When she reached for his leash, he stood at once, loyal without question. She left a note on the table. Simple, thanking Mason for warmth, for kindness, for days that had reminded her what it felt like to breathe without fear. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again. Brielle noticed too late. She turned just as Mason reached for his coat. "No," Brielle said urgently, grabbing his arm. "Don't chase her. Don't make a mistake. We can fix this. We had a life." Mason looked at her hand on his sleeve, then gently but firmly removed it. "I loved you once," he said quietly. "That doesn't disappear, but it doesn't decide my future either." He stepped into the night. Ellie moved slowly along the drive, crutches sinking. Into fresh snow, Atlas walking tight against her leg, shielding her from the wind. Her breath came in short, broken clouds. "Mason!" His voice cut through the storm. She stopped, but didn't turn. When he reached her, his chest heaving from the run, snow clinging to his hair and beard, she finally faced him. Tears streamed freely now, her composure gone. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have stayed. I shouldn't have let myself forget where I stand." Mason shook his head. "You didn't take anything from me." She laughed once, broken. "I'm not whole. I'm not easy. You deserve someone who doesn't come with damage." He stepped closer, close enough that Atlas wagged his tail cautiously, sensing the shift. "I didn't start breathing again because of my past," Mason said. "I started because of you. Because you sat at my table, because you stayed, because you made my house feel alive." Ellie's voice cracked. "What if you wake up one day and realize I'm not enough?" Mason pulled her into his arms, holding her firmly, protectively, as if anchoring her to the ground. "I'm choosing you," he said against her hair. "Not out of pity, not because you're broken, but because you're here, because you see me, because the future feels possible again when you're in it." Atlas pressed against them, tail wagging hard now, whining softly as if urging them to stay together. Behind them, the cabin light glowed steadily through the falling snow. Inside, Brielle stood alone, watching the shapes blur through the window. Regret settled heavy in her chest. She understood then that some doors, once closed, did not reopen. With a final look, she turned away, disappearing into the night she had brought with her. Mason guided Ellie back toward the house, one careful step at a time. Snow continued to fall, but the cold no longer reached them. The days that followed the storm settled into a calm that felt earned rather than accidental. The forest no longer roared outside the cabin. Snow fell lightly now, almost gently, as if the land itself had decided to give them room to breathe. One morning, Mason carried the wooden box outside. Ellie watched from the porch, wrapped in a thick sweater, Atlas sitting at her feet. Mason set the box near the fire pit behind the cabin. He didn't rush. He opened it carefully, taking one last look at the letters inside. His face held no anger, no bitterness, only recognition. "These were real," he said quietly. "They mattered, but they don't belong to who I am anymore." He fed the letters into the fire one by one. Paper curled, ink disappeared. The past lifted into smoke and thinned into the cold air. Mason stood still until the last ember faded. Ellie's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. She understood what he was giving up. Not a woman, but a version of himself that had lived too long in memory. When Mason returned to her, she rested her forehead briefly against his chest. No words were needed. A week later, Brielle came back. This time, she didn't knock urgently. She waited. Brielle looked different than she had on that first night. Her posture was straighter, her coat neat, her face calmer. The brittleness was still there, but so was resolve. She spoke softly, without accusation. "I'm not here to change anything," she said. "I just needed to say I'm sorry." She apologized to Ellie first, for the fear, for the cruelty born of her own regret. She admitted she had mistaken safety for love and control for stability. Turning to Mason, she thanked him for the years he had tried and for letting her go when she hadn't known how to stay. Ellie listened quietly. She saw not a rival, but a woman carrying her own wreckage. When Brielle left, there were no slammed doors, just closure. Months passed. Spring crept into the valley, softening the edges of snowbanks. Ellie grew stronger. She learned the trails around the cabin, moved with more confidence on her prosthetic, laughed more freely. Mason learned something too, how to plan a future without waiting for orders. Atlas thrived, his coat glossy, his world stable at last. 5 months after the night they met, Mason took Ellie back to the forest road where he had first stopped his truck. Snow still lined the trees, though thinner now, melting into earth. He knelt. Ellie froze, heart racing. Mason! He smiled, nervous in a way she had never seen him before. He held out a simple ring, unadorned and strong. "I won't promise you an easy life," he said, "but I promise I'll choose you every day I'm allowed to." Ellie's voice shook. "Would you really choose a wife with only one leg?" Mason stood, cupping her face gently. "I'm not choosing perfection. I'm choosing the woman who kept walking when everything collapsed." She said yes through tears and laughter both. Their wedding was small, the cabin, a few friends, the forest standing witness. Ellie wore a simple dress. Atlas carried the rings, tail wagging furiously. There was no grandeur, only truth. When Mason's leave ended, the snow returned lightly, dusting the world in white. Ellie stood beside the truck. Atlas pressed against her leg. Mason kissed her slowly, memorizing the moment. "I'll come back," he promised. Ellie smiled. "I know." He drove away, as he always had. But this time, the road led somewhere he belonged. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive as thunder or light from the sky. They come quietly, disguised as a stranger who stops. A door that opens. A hand that reaches out when the night feels endless. Maybe that was God's work all along, not changing the storm, but placing the right soul on the road at the exact moment someone could no longer walk alone. In our daily lives, we pray for answers, for signs, for relief. But often, God answers through people, through small acts of courage, through kindness that asks for nothing in return. A simple choice can become a miracle. A simple yes can become a family. If this story touched your heart, perhaps it's because you've been there too. Lost, tired, carrying more than anyone can see. Today, may God remind you that you are not forgotten, that even in the coldest season, He is still working quietly in your life. Please share this story with someone who might need hope tonight. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe in stories of healing, love, and second chances,